We like to believe that we have mapped every corner of our world and catalogued every living thing that walks upon it. Our satellites peer into the deepest jungles, and our sensors track the movement of life across every continent with digital precision. Yet, in the shadows of the Himalayas or the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, a persistent whisper remains for us to hear. It is the idea of the hidden species, massive bipedal creatures that have supposedly walked alongside us for millennia without ever being caught. From the Yeti of Tibet to the Sasquatch of North America, these legends are remarkably consistent across cultures that never even met. We call them cryptids, a word that sits uncomfortably between the rigorous world of biology and the campfire stories of our ancestors. Why does the human mind cling so desperately to the possibility of a giant, undiscovered primate hiding just out of our sight? Perhaps it is because for most of human history, the world really was full of giants that we had to fear and respect. Our ancestors shared the earth with megafauna, massive animals like the giant ground sloth or the towering Gigantopithecus that once ruled the land. To an early human, a 3-meter-tall ape wasn't a myth or a blurry photograph, it was a terrifying and very physical reality. The Gigantopithecus blackie lived in Southeast Asia for nearly 2 million years, only going extinct around 300,000 years ago. This means that early humans likely encountered these massive primates, weaving their presence into the very fabric of our earliest oral traditions. When we look for the Yeti today, are we looking for a physical creature or are we chasing a ghost in our DNA? Modern sightings often follow a specific pattern: a fleeting glimpse in the fog, a massive footprint in the mud, or a strange cry. These accounts are often dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, yet they provide the fuel that keeps the mystery burning for decades. In 1951, explorer Eric Shipton took a photograph of a large humanoid footprint in the snow of Mount Everest's Menlung Basin. That single image ignited a global obsession, transforming a local Tibetan legend into a modern scientific puzzle for the Western world. Suddenly, the abominable snowman wasn't just folklore, it was a target for well-funded expeditions and serious biological inquiry by elite researchers. But as we applied the tools of the 20th century to the mountains, the physical evidence began to tell a much stranger story. To understand the truth, we must move past the stories and look at the hard data hidden within the cells themselves. For decades, the primary evidence for these creatures consisted of grainy film, plaster casts of footprints, and tufts of mystery hair. But in the 21st century, we developed a way to read the biological history of the world without ever seeing the animal. This is environmental DNA, or eDNA, the microscopic traces of skin, hair, and waste that every living thing leaves behind in its path. In 2014, a team led by Professor Brian Sykes from the University of Oxford conducted the first large-scale genetic survey of cryptid remains. They collected dozens of hair samples from around the world that were claimed to belong to Yetis, Sasquatches, and other unknown primates. The scientific community watched with bated breath as the most advanced DNA sequencing technology was applied to these legendary artifacts. The results were definitive, but they didn't reveal a new species of ape. Instead, they revealed the diversity of known wildlife. Most of the Yeti hairs from the Himalayas actually belong to a prehistoric subspecies of the Himalayan brown bear or the Tibetan blue bear. In North America, the Bigfoot samples were identified as cows, horses, raccoons, and in several embarrassing cases, ordinary human hair. To a scientist, this wasn't a failure, but a fascinating lesson in how our eyes interpret the unfamiliar in the wild. When a hiker sees a large dark shape in a snowstorm, their brain doesn't see a bear, it searches for a narrative. This is pareidolia, the human tendency to see significant patterns, especially faces and humanoid forms, where they don't actually exist. Our brains are hardwired for survival, and in the wild, it is safer to mistake a rock for a monster than a monster for a rock. Yet, even as the DNA tests came back negative for monsters, they raised a new and equally compelling scientific mystery. Some of the Yeti DNA matched a 40,000-year-old jawbone from a polar bear found in the Arctic Svalbard region. This suggested that a rare, ancient hybrid bear might still be roaming the high altitudes of the Himalayas, hidden from modern biology. If a bear can remain undiscovered or misidentified for centuries, could something else be hiding in the vast, vertical wilderness? To answer that, we have to look at the math of habitability. how much space does a giant primate actually need to survive? Large animals require massive amounts of calories and a stable breeding population to avoid the genetic bottleneck of extinction. When we look at the calories available in a high-altitude desert or a deep forest, the biological reality begins to set in. To survive, a population of large primates would need thousands of square kilometers of connected, calorie-rich habitat. Ecology tells us that the larger the animal, the lower its population density must be to avoid starving the environment. If a breeding population of Sasquatches existed in North America, we should theoretically see them as often as we see bears. Yet, while we have thousands of high-definition videos of rare snow leopards, we have zero definitive footage of a North American ape. This brings us to the taxonomic paradox. The more we look for something without finding it, the less likely it is to exist. However, the history of science is also full of moments where the experts were proven wrong by a single, stubborn survivor. Take the coelacanth, a prehistoric fish thought to have gone extinct 66 million years ago along with the mighty dinosaurs. In 1938, a living specimen was pulled from the ocean off the coast of South Africa, shocking the entire scientific community. Or the okapi, a creature so strange that Western scientists dismissed it as a Congolese unicorn until it was officially documented in 1901. These Lazarus taxa remind us that nature is incredibly good at hiding its secrets in places humans find difficult to reach. The deep oceans and the dense, vertical jungles of the tropics are the most likely candidates for harboring these lost biological treasures. But there is a significant difference between a fish in the dark abyss and a 300-kilogram primate living near hiking trails. A large land mammal leaves behind a massive biological footprint, including scat, skeletal remains, and distinct pathways through the brush. In the case of the Yeti, many of the footprints found in the snow are actually the result of a phenomenon called sun melting. A small track from a fox or a bird can melt and expand in the mountain sun, merging into a humanoid shape. This is where the line between objective reality and the power of human suggestion begins to blur into a single image. We must also consider the role of cultural reinforcement. When a story is told so often, it becomes a filter for everything. Anthropologists suggest that these legends serve as a boundary between the civilized world of the village and the wild chaos of nature. By putting a face on the unknown, we make the terrifying vastness of the wilderness feel just a little bit more personal. But if the monsters aren't in the woods, then we have to ask, what is it that we are actually seeing? The absence of a physical body does not mean the phenomenon is fake. It means the source might be psychological. In psychology, expectancy theory suggests that when we go into the woods looking for a monster, our brain prepares us. Every snapped twig becomes a footstep, and every bear standing on its hind legs becomes a bipedal giant in our memory. This is further complicated by the hoaxer's legacy individuals who spend their lives creating fake evidence to keep the dream alive. From Ray Wallace's wooden feet in 1958 to modern CGI videos, these fakes muddy the waters of legitimate biological research. But let's play the devil's advocate and look at the most remote regions left on our crowded planet Earth. There are places like the Hkakabo-Razi in Myanmar or the deep valleys of Bhutan where humans rarely, if ever, tread. If a relic population of a giant ape survived, it would have to be incredibly intelligent, social, and perfectly camouflaged. It would need to be a master of the shadows, capable of avoiding infrared cameras, drones, and the chemical signatures of humans. This implies a level of cognitive evolution that would rival or even surpass our own primitive ancestors' ability to survive. We have discovered over 400 new mammal species since the year 2000, but most are small rodents or bats. The discovery of the saola in Vietnam in 1992 showed that a large unknown mammal could still hide in plain sight. However, the saola is an elusive forest ox, not a giant primate that supposedly ranges across entire mountain ranges and continents. This is the wall that cryptozoology eventually hits, the law of trophic levels and the necessity of a food chain. An apex predator or a large herbivore leaves a trail of consumed resources that satellites should eventually be able to detect. As our thermal imaging becomes more sensitive, the hiding places for a giant warm-blooded mammal are rapidly shrinking towards zero. If we eventually scan every inch of the Himalayas and find nothing but bears and goats, what happens to the legend? Legends don't die from a lack of evidence, they simply evolve to fit the fears and technologies of the current era. Perhaps the Yeti is no longer a creature of flesh and bone, but a symbol of the wild unknown we fear losing. In an age of total surveillance, the idea of something that cannot be tracked is the ultimate form of rebellion. As we strip away the layers of mystery with our sensors and DNA kits, we find ourselves at a strange philosophical crossroads. If we prove that the Yeti and Sasquatch do not exist, we gain a fact, but we lose a part of our wonder. We live in a world where almost every square meter of land has been photographed, analyzed, and commercialized by human interest. The hidden species represents the last frontier, the idea that nature still holds a secret that is too big for us to control. While the biological evidence for a giant primate is thin, the psychological evidence for our need for them is overwhelming. We are creatures of the savannah who spent millions of years looking over our shoulders, alert to the predators in the tall grass. Our modern, safe lives have suppressed these instincts, but they haven't erased them. They simply wait for a dark night to return. This is why even the most rational scientist might feel a shiver of excitement when a new, blurry video surfaces on the internet. It is the hope that the world is still bigger than our maps, and that the story of life is still being written. Science doesn't exist to kill the mystery. It exists to refine it, moving us from blind superstition to informed awe. Whether these creatures are flesh and blood or simply the shadows cast by our own ancient fears, they serve a vital purpose. They remind us to look up from our screens and truly see the vast, unforgiving, and beautiful complexity of the natural world. They remind us that we are not the masters of the Earth, but merely one of its many curious and often confused inhabitants. Perhaps one day, a hiker in a truly remote corner of the world will stumble upon a discovery that changes everything. Until then, the forests will remain silent, and the mountains will keep their secrets tucked away in the thin, cold air. We will continue to search, not because we expect to find a monster, but because we need to know what is still possible. Every footprint we analyze and every hair we sequence brings us closer to understanding the true nature of our planet and ourselves. The universe is a very large place, and even on our small blue dot, there is still room for a little bit of magic. So, the next time you find yourself alone in the deep woods and you hear a branch snap behind you, don't be afraid. Just remember that the most amazing thing about the unknown is that it is still out there, waiting for you to find it.